So welcome everyone. The Daynard Public Interest Visiting Fellows Program brings distinguished public interest practitioners to campus virtually this year, but to campus each academic year for a 3-day visit. The fellows serve as role models for students, demonstrating how legal skills can be used effectively and creatively to make the world a better place. This vibrant program was established in 2004 through the generosity of Professor Richard Daynard, president of the law school's Public Interest Advocacy Institute, and his wife, Carol Iskles Daynard, and is administered by the law school's Center for Public Interest Advocacy and Collaboration. A special thanks to Dick and Carol for their continued support. Today, we're delighted to virtually welcome as our Daynard Fellow for the winter 2020 quarter, R.J. Thompson, who is a human rights lawyer, organizer, and educator. He is currently the managing director of the Sex Worker Project and the project director of the Human Rights Project at the Urban Justice Center. Prior to joining the Urban Justice Center, RJ worked as the Fair Courts Project community educator at Lambda Legal, where he trained judges, attorneys, and court staff on gender and sexuality cultural competency, and advocated for judicial diversity and judicial independence. RJ's previous work also includes serving as the Miami High Road Coordinator with the Restaurant Opportunity Center United, as Director of the Human Rights Program at the Woodhull Sexual Freedom Alliance, as the National Campaign and Advocacy Manager at the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Community Center in New York City, and as Membership Coordinator at the U.S. Human Rights Network Coordinating Center. RJ received his JD from City University of New York Law School and his BA in Africana Studies and Political Science from the University of South Florida in Tampa. Please join me in offering a warm Northeastern welcome to RJ Thompson. RJ?
Thank you so much, Dean Hackney. I appreciate the warm welcome. I know that bios can be long, and so I just want to add into the introduction. I think it's important for folks to know that I am also a mixed blood Indigenous person, Cherokee Nation. I'm also a queer, pansexual, poly person, and a Buddhist as well as a former sex worker. So all of those identities are really key to who I am and important to me, in addition to the identity of lawyer and attorney. And to start off, I also would really like to share my gratitude. As a Buddhist, gratitude is really central to my life, and I've found that gratitude makes everything better. So I want to thank Northeastern University School of Law community, all of the students. I know I've heard that you are the ones that have brought me here. I thank you. Dean Hackney, once again, thank you so much to all the work put in by Shannon Al-Wakil, Lucy Williams, Professor Martha Davis, Professor Aziza Ahmed, and Abby Waddleton for this incredible opportunity this week and all it took behind the scenes to make it happen. I want to thank the love of my life, my fiance, Joshua Rodriguez, for being my best friend, lover, family, and teammate in life. The incredible staff of the Sex Workers Project of the Urban Justice Center, who are amazing beyond words, and to Doug Lasden, the founder of UJC, as well as Juhu Thukral, the founder of the Sex Workers Project, for the platform to create SWP 20 years ago and make it thrive. And to all of my UJC family, as well as my activist family of 25 years in the restaurant worker rights, LGBT rights, sex worker rights, anti-death penalty, sexual freedom, reproductive justice, and prison abolition movements. Thank you to my birth family for never stopping at tolerance or acceptance, but landing at affirmation of all my complex identities, no matter how different from theirs. Thank you to all my chosen family who are listening today. You know who you are. Thank you to my political mentor, Ajamu Baraka, as well as my mentor in life, Daisaku Ikeda, and my SGI Buddhist family. And finally, thank you to my mom, my best friend, who is the reason I am who I am. You're forever missed and always with me. So today, I want you to stop and vision with me for a moment here in the beginning, if you would. Stop, the thoughts of your daily busy life, work, school, and vision with me for a moment and understand that we humans create the world and society and laws that govern our lives, and that we humans can create the world we want to live in, which for me is a sustainable, peaceful world of respect for the dignity of all living beings. A world of economic justice with the economic and social human rights to health, education, housing, and thriving wages, a reality for all people. A world without white supremacist patriarchal capitalism, which I view as one overarching interlocking system with many manifestations. A world where justice is restorative and transformative, not based on bloodlust and vengeance. We must do better, folks. We don't have time to waste. Our human evolution mentally, emotionally, sexually, and spiritually is urgent in these times, as we see from climate change and so many other circumstances we face collectively. If 2020 has not opened our eyes to our collective future and our collective karma, I'm not sure what will. In this talk today, I will likely give you more questions than answers, but let me tell you that there is no shortage of things we need to question. I will also ask you to remember or to realize that life is complex. It is not binary. Even when we talk about things being non-binary, we often replicate binaries in the same sentence in the same day. Life is not good versus evil. It is messy and complicated and does not exist in sound bites, categories, or taglines. This is true of most things in the world, and this is true of sex work as well. So today I'm going to break my talk down into about 3 different areas, which again are not boxes, but all intersect based on the title, the human rights of people working in the sex trades. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what are human rights? What do I mean by that? What are the sex trades? What do we mean by that? And then bringing that together, what are the human rights issues facing those of us who work in the sex trade? So what are human rights? Human rights are inherent, inalienable, and by virtue of our existence. They are not based on nation state or nationality. They are not based on identity, though they are also not ignorant or blind to our identities. One of the main reasons to have any government actually is for the promotion and protection of human rights. That is one of the most fundamental reasons for the existence of any government, is the promotion and protection of human rights within its borders. And why human rights as a frame? Civil rights is insufficient, and true social justice can never exist without the recognition, protection, and promotion of the full spectrum of our human rights. We are not one-dimensional people, and we do not, one subset of human rights, such as civil rights, can never fully account for the issues we face in our lives and that our communities face. The full spectrum of human rights must be protected and promoted in this country and around the world, including economic, social, cultural, civil, political, sexual, and environmental rights. Human rights are intersectional inherently. Intersectionality as a concept may not have been coined until recent decades, but the human rights framework from 1948 till now has always been inherently intersectional and understands that what does the right to vote mean if someone doesn't have food or shelter for example, that all parts of our lives are intersectional. For true social justice to exist, we in this country need to demand the full spectrum of human rights. Ignoring human rights in the United States has been purposeful for 80 years now. Most people do not know that history of the purposeful exclusion of economic, social, and cultural rights, not to mention sexual and environmental rights in this country. The narrow focus on civil and political rights is purposeful. Dr. Carol Anderson writes an amazing book about this hidden history in our country called Eyes Off the Prize, and I highly recommend it as basic reading for anyone who cares about social justice. She explains how even people like Eleanor Roosevelt, who were instrumental in creating the modern paradigm of human rights, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, were complicit in narrowing the human rights struggle in this country to a civil rights struggle, because people in power were afraid and are afraid today that people having their economic and social rights recognized and promoted would be a threat to capitalist interests. And so they conflated economic and social rights with communism and socialism, as they continue to do today, and which is why we are not a party to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, not to mention many other human rights treaties that the US ignores. Eyes Off the Prize is a great work that details how issues such as housing, work, education, and health should never have been and should not be matters of benefits, charity, services, or privilege. They are human rights we are all entitled to because we exist. No more, no less. And again, the government's purpose is to protect and promote not just civil rights, but the full spectrum of human rights. While no country on the planet is perfect at this, many, many, many other countries do much better jobs of at least recognizing the full complexity and totality of the human rights framework. And we are not even close to that in this country. The powers that be wanted us to think narrowly in terms of civil rights, and they pushed the Black liberation movement in the 1950s to do so. Eleanor Roosevelt even threatened to come off the board of the NAACP if folks continued to talk about economic and social rights like housing, health, education, and the right to work with dignity. The focus on voting rights and other civil and political rights matters, while not unimportant, was maybe an eighth at most of the full spectrum of human rights, in that there are 8 subsets of the human rights framework, and 6 of them largely ignored. So while we still have civil and political rights problems in this country, we have almost no framework at the local, state, or national level, with very few exceptions, that recognizes decent work, housing, health, and education as rights. We must change this. If not in our lifetimes, we need to lay the foundational groundwork to change this for future generations. If we expect the things that plague this country to change, we cannot pretend that people's basic needs are anything other than rights that need to be respected, protected, and promoted. It is ridiculous that in a country as wealthy as ours, that our budget goes in disproportionate, exorbitant amounts to the military-industrial complex, and yet we cannot have universal health care in this country, or thriving wages for all people, or housing as a guaranteed fundamental human right. There is also the notion of people-centered human rights, rather than a top-down approach to human rights that some may be familiar with. We believe in a people-centered approach to human rights, where communities are the experts on our needs and our issues, where there is no rescue mentality and there is no rescue industry, that others do not get to say what the human rights-based solutions are to issues facing our communities. As an Indigenous person, this is very important to me, the concept of including people's rights, collective rights, as well as individual rights. We must advocate for higher standards in this country, much higher standards. This country is a country where the masses accept such low standards. From the two-party corporate-dominated political system that runs this country with very little difference in terms of their foreign policy and approach to the military-industrial complex and occupation around the world, we have to change our standards as people living in this country. We have to advocate and demand much higher, more proactive, progressive standards starting locally. If the federal government will not recognize the full spectrum of human rights, we must demand that our cities and towns and counties do, and they can do so from the bottom up. We must also, as activists, stop replicating the insular, isolationist US mentality that our government has. I've seen time and time again in the 7 movements I've worked in, a tendency, conscious or not, to be insular and isolationist, and to think that state, local, and federal advocacy are the only levels of advocacy to be had, and to ignore the inter-American human rights system and the global UN system that other grassroots activists around the world engage with normally and as a matter of course. We cannot replicate isolationist mentalities in the 21st century. So having laid out the basic framework for human rights brings us to what are the sex trades? So the sex trades is a very large umbrella of different types of jobs, some of which are legalized in the United States and some of which are criminalized in the United States. This work includes things such as go-go dancing, stripping, erotic dancing, online work such as OnlyFans, escorting, whether sexual and or companionship based, BDSM, including BDSM therapies, sex shops, porn, whether print or digital, street-based sex work, erotic or sensual massage, and sex surrogates, to name just a handful. So sex work is a huge umbrella term trying to encompass the lived realities of many of us across a spectrum of class, race, gender, migration, and many other differences. Sex workers, it's important to note, provide valuable services to people who need them. We save lives. You will almost never hear this in the stories about us. You will almost always hear victim narratives about us, how we need to do different work, what is wrong about sex work, morally or otherwise. And yet we literally save people's lives. And we know that based on what our customers and clients tell us. We help people who are experiencing severe social or sexual anxiety, depression, people, differently abled people in all sorts of ways, experience intimacy, friendship, sex, and other aspects of their lives. We help people who feel they cannot be out about their sexuality, and we even provide end-of-life care, which I'm sure most of you have never thought about. I have friends and colleagues who have held clients in their arms by their request as they pass into their next existence. And I have been told many times by my clients as well that I made them feel seen and human when they had not felt seen or human in many, many years, if ever. And so sex work is valuable work. It is work with dignity. It is good work and it is necessary work. Having said that, I'm not here to romanticize the sex trades. However, I will say that the stigma and negativity surrounding the messaging and narratives and stereotypes about sex work demand that we lift up and raise the positive, life-affirming, and empowering stories that so many of us have experienced as sex workers and or as clients of sex workers. No job is just good or bad. Again, life is complicated, things exist on a spectrum. All jobs have pros and cons. All jobs have good and bad days. All jobs have choice, circumstance, and perhaps coercion involved. But it is important to leave today knowing that sex workers save lives. Who works in the sex trades? Queer young people, disproportionately, many of whom do not have affirming or accepting families of origin. Undocumented people, trans people across the gender spectrum, gay and bisexual men, cisgender women, and the stereotypes of who we are dominate the narratives to this day, from movies to television to the media. You mostly will hear victim narratives, as I said, or perhaps the happy hooker narrative, which is the other extreme of that spectrum. At the Sex Workers Project of the Urban Justice Center, we think about and talk about sex work on a spectrum of choice, circumstance, and coercion. Again, this is a spectrum of lived experience. This is not three neat boxes that we can put people in. Many of our clients have done freely chosen sex work that was empowering and enjoyable to them. And also those same people may have been survivors of human trafficking at different points in their life. And so when we talk about human trafficking and sex work, survivors of trafficking and sex workers, those are not even always two separate groups of people. We need to unlearn the binary way that we think about things. The spectrum of choice, circumstance, and coercion can also apply to almost any job you can think of. How do choice and circumstance and coercion intersect? For example, I entered sex work to help me get a handle on my six-figure law school debt. As a public interest lawyer, as some of you will find out or have found out, we don't make the same money, especially at the beginning of our career, as our counterparts in the corporate sector and for-profit law firms. Sex work for me came naturally. It was something I was good at. And I found out the more that I did it, that I was doing good in the world as a sex worker. And for that, I have no regrets. And I know that I helped many people, just as I've helped people as an activist and a lawyer and a personal trainer. Everything I've done in my life has helped people in a different way. And all of that is important. It does not exist on a hierarchy in my view. Choice and circumstance intersect. I chose to do sex work, but I also had a financial need to do so. There were very few jobs I could make the money I was making as an escort in the time that I made it in. And so for people who are comfortable with this job, who are good at this job, who have natural abilities to connect with people, not just sexually, but also otherwise, this is an option that many of us choose. And it's also based in circumstance for many of us. That doesn't have to be one or the other. I invite you to ask yourself, if you've never thought of it this way, around the issue of coercion and circumstance and choice. If one's family has an expectation of a certain career path for an individual from birth or childhood, and that child is told their whole lives that they will be or should be a doctor or lawyer or pharmacist or what have you, is that not a form of coercion? Is there not family coercion, societal coercion, cultural coercion? Does that person have choice ultimately in the work they end up doing? Or do we not ask that because their choice of job that also has a coercive element from their family in this example is a respectable job, is a job that's considered to create value in the world, or that's valued in our capitalist hierarchy of work? I would say that most jobs people do involve some combination of choice, circumstance, and coercion. And the people who are at the extremes of that spectrum exist, of course. But to focus only on the extremes of that spectrum, the happy hooker in the context of sex work, usually portrayed as a cisgender white woman who does sex work simply from a place of sexual liberation and freedom, or the human trafficking victim or sex worker who is living on the street and needs to be saved and rescued by, usually in the media, portrayed as a rich white man. These extreme narratives can never represent the reality of all of us, many, many people living in the gray areas, living in the middle of that spectrum of choice, circumstance, and coercion. Many of our clients at the Sex Workers Project of the Urban Justice Center are undocumented trans sex workers. Another example of choice and circumstance intersecting is that there are so many formal barriers in the formal economies, I should say barriers in the formal economies to trans women. In 2020, trans women have disgustingly low rates of employability in the formal economies because of rampant transphobia in the workplaces. And also for undocumented people, for undocumented migrants, there of course are many barriers to jobs in the formal economy. And so many of our clients are undocumented transgender sex workers from Latin America, and their experience in the sex trades is one of both choice and circumstance. And I implore you to understand that most things, again, are a both and, not an either or. And so often when this narrative is told, people may come to the conclusion that those folks want to or need to leave the sex trades, right? To do some other kind of work in the formal economies. And yet if you speak to people directly, many of them will tell you that they are not in a hurry to leave the sex trades, that they enjoy working in the sex trades, that they have had financial or otherwise empowering experiences in the sex trades. And that does include Black trans women, that does include migrant trans women, that does include street-based workers. It is not only the most privileged sex workers who have empowering experiences through sex work. In fact, many of the people I know who share the most beautiful, empowering stories of their experiences in the sex trades are people from the most marginalized and most directly impacted communities in terms of criminalization. So this both and can exist, that there is nothing inherently bad or wrong about sex work, and there should not be those barriers to the formal economies. People should have the choice to do the work they are good at and want to do, regardless of their migration status, regardless of their gender identity and expression. And there simultaneously is nothing wrong with sex work. Usually we hear an either or approach and an either or narrative when it comes to these issues. So, I invite you to ask yourself, what is work? What is labor? What work is valued in this society? What does it mean to be professional, right? Many of you are in professional school. What does that mean? What access does that give us? I know for me, it has given me a lot of unearned privilege. The fact that I'm an attorney has given me so much unearned privilege, in addition to being white passing, in addition to being a cisgender man. The level of privilege that lawyers have in this society is actually incredible, and really, for the most part, unfounded in my view. Work is work, labor is labor, and also there are many types of work that involve the body, that involve intimate labor, and it's very important that we note that sex work is not the only work where people are using their bodies. It is also not the only work that involves intimacy. And yet somehow it is shamed and stigmatized so deeply compared to any of these other jobs. Many jobs involve intimacy besides jobs in the sex trades, including nursing, hospice care, personal grooming related work, yet those are not stigmatized. Hospice care is lifted up, as incredibly praiseworthy work. Why is sex work different? Many jobs involve bodily labor, such as construction work or being a personal trainer, but they are not stigmatized, even though you're using your body. Why is sex work so stigmatized? Is it the sex part of sex work that is so deeply stigmatized? My answer would be absolutely. We live in a culture, the dominant mainstream US culture, that is so torn about sex and sexuality. We at the same time hypersexualize things and see sex everywhere, and at the same time are told from a baby that that topic is taboo, that it is private, that we don't talk about it. and for most of us that we should experience shame around it. There is so much deep stigma around our sex and sexuality, and the Sex Workers Project of the Urban Justice Center and our amazing staff are working every day to undo that stigma, to chip away at that stigma, so that people can have true sexual liberation, true sexual freedom. People should be free to be themselves, no matter their gender, their sexuality, or any other part of their identity. We are so deeply repressed in this society still in 2020. Many of us not even knowing the depths of our own repression. I call on you to really think about your own identities, your own sexualities, your own work experiences, your own labor, and what those things have meant in your life and where they intersect and where they don't, and where you might do the internal work of liberating yourself more. Because when we liberate ourselves, we can liberate collectively. Also, with regard to work, there is a deep social and economic hierarchy of how labor is valued. And I've touched on this, right? Doctors, lawyers, accountants, what have you. At the top of that hierarchy, and low-wage workers, undocumented workers, always at the bottom of that hierarchy. There is so much that restaurant workers, having been one myself and worked in the restaurant worker rights movement, domestic workers, sex workers, farm workers share in common. And yet the stigma, the worker rights violations and the exploitation is what they have in common, but the stigma around sex work is so deep that even our allies in other labor movements really don't want to touch this issue. They say that sex work is work, but we have so much deep stigma that rarely are they willing to put their neck out and stand in true solidarity with us when it comes to public policy advocacy and changing the laws that criminalize our work and our lives. To those in professional school, the lawyers and law students listening today, I would really like to say to you, and I've been sharing this in different ways with the student one-on-ones I've been doing today, which have been amazing so far, that you must choose your path for you and be true to your heart and soul. You do not have to litigate. You do not have to do policy work. You do not have to do direct legal services. You do not have to be an academic to be a real lawyer. You have to do what is in your heart and what sets your heart on fire. Make your own path. People will judge this, as they did when I left Lambda Legal to be a certified personal trainer, or when I decided to do sex work full-time with a JD. People will judge you, and doors will also be closed to you. And in the theme of the both and, not the either or, you will be happier and you will see great benefits in your life if you follow your true path. I guarantee that to you. So turning to the last section that I want to focus on before we open up to Q&A is where what we've talked about with human rights and the sex trades intersect. The human rights of sex workers, specifically in the United States. Human rights that impact sex workers include the rights to bodily autonomy and self-determination, the human right to work, including the right to thriving wages, freedom from wage theft, freedom from sexual harassment and violence in the workplace, freedom from discrimination, racial discrimination, for example, that is rampant in strip clubs, in the porn industry, and across all sectors of the sex trades, just like in the rest of society. The freedom to work and not fear being arrested, and all the collateral consequences associated with criminalization, including housing, parenting, employment in the formal economies, and immigration consequences, to name a few. The deep stigma and the patriarchal, puritanical double standards that I was talking about earlier are a huge impediment to the realization of the human rights of people in the sex trades. If cisgender men could bear children, I often say there would be zero political or social controversy around the human right to abortion. And yes, I said the human right to abortion. Stigma-related shame and secrecy around sex and sexuality deeply harms our human rights and perpetuates violations of our human rights. Sex, sexuality, and sex work need to come out of the shadows to end social taboos. If you are engaging in consensual acts with adults, there is nothing wrong with what you are doing. I am so grateful to be an SGI Nichiren Buddhist and to be part of a faith tradition, one of the few religious traditions that has no concepts of guilt, shame, or sin, but instead understands the oneness of good and evil, and that the same thing that creates value for one person may not create value for someone else, and that every individual must determine what does or does not create value for their own life in any given moment or circumstances. One of the most harmful things that prevents the realization of the human rights of people in the sex trades is the conflation of sex work and human trafficking. I would be remiss if I did not include this in my comments today. This is something we at the Sex Workers Project of the Urban Justice Center deal with every day, from the United Nations to city council meetings to federal congressional environments, from the media, the general public, elected officials, celebrities, and other advocates. And it is the conflation of human trafficking and sex work. Human trafficking is an egregious, gross violation of human rights in all cases. And for 20 years, the Sex Workers Project of the Urban Justice Center has fought to end human trafficking. The majority of our clients are survivors of human trafficking, and therefore we are an anti-trafficking organization, as well as a sex worker rights organization. People talk about these two movements and organizations as if they are separate, and that flies in the face of the reality of who we are at the Sex Workers Project of the Urban Justice Center. We are both and. Human trafficking exists across labor sectors, yet sex work abolitionists and so-called end-demand or Nordic model advocates claim sex work should be eradicated or lessened in order to combat human trafficking. When I ask why they do not call for the abolition of the labor sectors where trafficking is even more prevalent, such as farm labor or domestic labor, these anti-trafficking advocates have no answer. Because in reality, their agenda is an anti-sex work agenda disguised as an anti-trafficking agenda. The true anti-trafficking advocates are those of us fighting for the decriminalization of sex work and an end to all forms of worker rights violations in all labor sectors. Work is not exploitation. Work is not exploitation. Work is not human trafficking. Exploitation is not work. Trafficking is not work. These two issues must not be conflated. It directly harms and even kills sex workers because of this conflation. All work should be consensual. All work should be consensual, just like all sex should be consensual. Human trafficking is prevalent in many other industries, including farm labor, domestic labor, and even restaurant labor. Yet in those sectors, work is distinguished from trafficking, whereas in the sex trades, the two are constantly conflated as one. We are told by abolitionists and end-demand anti-trafficking advocates to our faces that we do not exist, that we as current and former sex workers are brainwashed, that our labor was not or is not real work, and to not even call ourselves workers. This is what they have told us to our face in meeting after meeting, from the local level to the UN level. Their narrow, paternalistic, missionary framework makes them feel good about themselves, but does not reflect the nuance, complexity, and reality of life, identities, and work, which has been a theme throughout my talk today and throughout the work of my life's career. It is a one-size-fits-all victim narrative that can never hold the complexities of the sex trades or of human reality. It is a modern-day product of colonialism and the white savior complex inherent in our colonialist, white supremacist, patriarchal capitalist society. White liberals love to engage in rescue, unfortunately. It presumes to know better for others' lives. It speaks for others. It is deeply oppressive, and it is often done in the name of feminism, which is offensive to those of us who know that feminism is about true liberation for all people. Feminism, in my view and in my comrades' views, is about humanizing women and girls while allowing people of all genders to be our full, complex selves, emotionally, sexually, physically, mentally, and spiritually. Some so-called feminists, especially second-wave white women, have actually internalized the patriarchy so much that they replicate patriarchal behaviors onto people of all genders, including other women and girls, taking away personal autonomy, agency, and again, assuming they know what is best for other human beings. Individuals know what is best for our own life. Let me repeat that because it bears repeating over and over again. Individuals know what is best for our own lives. Black folks know what is best for their own lives. Trans folks know what is best for their own lives. Sex workers, we know what is best for our lives and can speak for ourselves. When it comes to policy solutions, any solution that does not involve directly impacted people is not a solution that is tolerable. Furthermore, even things like services, social services that are mandated, which are part and parcel of the rescue industry, like in the human trafficking intervention courts and other so-called problem-solving courts across the country, are problematic. They believe that sex workers need to be fixed or rehabilitated in some way, shape, or form. They do not work. Social services, including counseling, are only effective when they are trauma-informed, harm reductive, and that means meeting folks where they are. They are not only appropriate they are only appropriate when freely chosen by the person receiving the service. Again, the theme of consent is constant across these issues. Sex should be fully consensual. Work should be fully consensual. And so should social services be fully consensual. Work without consent is unacceptable. Social services without consent is also unacceptable. The paternalistic, internalized patriarchy, white savior rescue complex, and the missionary mentalities among many lawyers, far too many advocates, social workers, and activists is alarming, and it is deeply harmful to people working in the sex trades. And it must be called out, it must be challenged, and it must be stopped. I would like to end with a quote from my mentor in life, Daisaku Ikeda. Quote, "A great human revolution in just a single individual will help achieve a change in the destiny of a nation, and further, can even enable a change in the destiny of all humankind," end quote. I implore each and every one of you listening today, lawyer, law student, or non-lawyer, to make the determination to engage in your own human revolution. If you do so, starting from deep inside yourself, sexually, emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually, you will transform your environment, your family, your friends, your coworkers, your schoolmates, and this world. It always begins with us. Thank you so much.